Now you start.
Thank you. Welcome all. I'm Somdita Karak, Science Communication and Public Outreach Officer at CCMB, and I wholeheartedly invite Dr. Sam Illingworth for the 7th CCMB Biologue. CCMB Biologue is a series of talks we have started with global experts, especially in life sciences. However, today among us, we have a leading science communicator in Dr. Illingworth. There are quite a few reasons why we have him on this forum today. Of his many achievements, let me start with his book, A Sonnet to Science, where he has written about 6 groundbreaking scientists who were also poets. I'm dearly hoping today we'll also get to hear more on this and in general, if and how an art form like poetry might help scientists think more creatively. Dr. Illingworth also runs an online poetry journal called The Consilience, where he, as he says, science and arts come together. He's the co-director of Manchester Games Studies Network. I and many of us in the audience would be very excited to know from him on their experience with games and science communication. He is an advocate for structuring science communication as many other forms of science, and he is the chief editor of Geoscience Communication, which is an open access journal on SciComm in geosciences. He's currently an associate professor at the Edinburgh Napier University. With no further ado, let me invite Dr. Sam Illingworth to take over the mic from here for this talk, Poetry of Science. Sam.
Thank you very much, Sundata, for that lovely introduction. So hi, everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about using poetry and games to develop dialogue between scientists and non-scientists. There'll be time at the end for questions, but I'd also invite everybody to please connect with me at any time via my email, my Twitter handle, Sam Illingworth, or via my website. And it'd be great to talk to you about some of the ideas that I talk about in this. And please do feel free to challenge me and maybe think about ways that we can collaborate together as well. So I want to begin with this hypothesis that poetry and games can be used to engender dialogue, giving voice to those audiences that are normally underheard and underserved by science and science communication. So when we're talking about science communication, a lot of the time we might be talking about developing a dialogue model or a model of participation, one in which we're moving away from a one-way stream of communication from the scientist to the non-scientist, and instead we're developing a two-way model of communication, wherein which the non-scientists are also feeding back their knowledge, their expertise, their experiences to the scientists to actually help them to develop their own fundamental research and research questions and to co-create those as well. And my argument is that poetry and games afford us an opportunity to do this in a really inclusive and engaging manner that means that we can reach those audiences that for many reasons don't always tend to be reached. So I'm going to start off with poetry. And this all really, I mean, my research really split between poetry and games. And so this talk split between poetry and games. And a lot of this started with my blog, The Poetry of Science, which I started about 6 years ago now. And the idea is that every week I read a research article and then write a poem about it in order to try and communicate that research to a wider audience. So the idea being that there's so much amazing scientific research out there, but that oftentimes it gets lost, and people who would find it useful, interesting, amazing, scary, inspirational, don't always see it. So what I tried to do is I tried to take that scientific research, turn it into a poem so that people can at least get an idea of what that research is about and then hopefully be inspired to find out more about it. So to give you an idea of what this process looks like, there was this amazing research done recently around fungal foraging behavior and hyphal space exploration in microstructured soil chips. And this is the paper. And this is actually it's a really, really well written scientific abstract. So I don't want to slag off the abstract at all because it's very, very well written, but it's not written for a non-scientific audience. Research articles are written for a scientific audience. And so we can see here, phrases such as, instead we provide a multivariate trait analysis acknowledging the complex trade-offs and microscale strategies that fungal mycelia exhibit. If you're not a scientist or if you're not an expert, that might not mean that much to you. This paper, what it basically is doing is it's looking at how different funguses behave, and in particular how they're hyphae. So, you know, those little, the little branches of the roots that go off from the fungus and try to get nutrients from the soil and other environments, how they behave in different underground situations or different environments, really. And it's very difficult to see how this is done in nature, because how do we see underground what's happening? So what these people in this study did was they actually made these silicon chips where they introduced a number of different complex obstacles that the hyphae could go down to try and see the behavior that these different funguses had when they were out searching for nutrients. And it was really interesting because they found that depending on the different fungus, the hyphae exhibited different behavior, and they gave these different names. So some of them they called soldiers because they tended to be not travel very far, but be very forceful and push everything out of the way. Others they called marathon runners because they tended to have like one lone hyphae going very far distances as like kind of a scout, but not being able to knock much things out of the way. And another they labeled the snake because it kind of slithered around obstacles. So this is like really amazing research. But if you were a non-scientist and you just happened to see this abstract, you might not necessarily be inclined to find out any more about the study. So this is the poem that I wrote about that. Ignoring classical concepts of exploration and exploitation, you strategize your advance across fabricated labyrinths that embrace your occupation. With reckless abandon, your feathery limbs race down obstacle courses of parallel lines, meandering squares, Z-shaped funnels and blocked passages, ploughing through barriers as you slither seamlessly between the confines of your artificial enclosure. Tentatively, you creep through sudden openings, pressing your advantage with intricate patterns of growth that seek to claim these counterfeited loams as their own. And with the poem, what I'm not necessarily trying to get the whole of the research across in that poem, but rather just to give people an idea about the amazing thing that is going on and hopefully inspire them to read more and to actually read the study in more depth. But is this dialogue, right? I don't know. I don't think it necessarily is. I think this is a very good example, if I say so myself, of one-way method of science communication. So you can find my blog there and the accompanying podcast, The Poetry of Science, available on all good podcast directories. But what this does is it's me picking a scientific study, thinking that it's cool or interesting or relevant or impactful, and then writing a poem about it in a way that aims to communicate that research to an audience, but doesn't necessarily create a two-way system through which dialogue can take place. Yeah, I can respond to comments and things like that, but we can't actually use the comments of a non-scientific audience in this instance to feed back into the original research. So I would say that whilst this is a very good example of one-way science communication, it's not necessarily dialogue. And where I think poetry is actually really powerful is in creating an environment in which this dialogue can take place. So I want to give you an example. This is a paper that I published a couple of years ago. And in this paper, we basically, in this study, we worked with a number of different communities across the United Kingdom to talk to them about their attitudes towards environmental change. And we worked with different publics that had maybe been traditionally underserved and underheard by environmental change communications. So these publics, you know, were identified as many different things, but some of the publics that we worked with were people living with mental health needs, were people who identified as asylum seekers and refugees. And what we did was we wanted to create an environment in which we could talk to this audience, find out what they knew about environmental change, and then feed that back to scientists who were working in environmental change, so that when those scientists were developing their mitigation and adaptation strategies, they were able to take these lived experiences and knowledges on board in order to modify that. And that's really important, because if you imagine, let's say you're planning a flood risk mitigation strategy, in a town or a village or a city. If you look at the data and then come up with an idea and say, yeah, put a block here, put a block here, but then don't actually speak to any of the people, you're missing out on this massive data set. You know, these people have been living there for 60, 70, 80 years. So why aren't you using their experiences? They will know which areas flood, which areas don't flood, which areas you can build blockades on, etc. And this is the same for many different environmental change mitigation and adaptation strategies. So as good scientists, we should be using all of the data at our disposal. So we should be working with these audiences, not because it's a box ticking exercise, but because these people know exactly what it is that will help us to ensure that what we're planning is more successful. So it's really important to bring together scientists and non-scientists. However, when we do that, we can often get established what I call hierarchies of intellect. So this is basically where you've got somebody who's a non-scientist, but they might be an expert in many other areas, like in their professional and personal lives. They might know an awful lot about the subject that's being discussed, be that air pollution, be that flooding, be that climate change, but they're not necessarily a scientist. So when they are in a room with scientists who have certain letters after their name and come from institutions, they might feel as though their voice isn't valued and that they are lower down on the hierarchies of intellect. So what we need to try and do is we need to try and level those hierarchies. And one of the best ways that we can do that is through writing poetry together. So this is the scientists and the non-scientists writing poetry together and using this as a starting point for dialogue. Now, it doesn't matter what that poem looks like. We're not interested in the aesthetic quality of the poem. We're interested in the conversations that it enables. And it's powerful for three reasons. Reason number one, it gives permission to the non-scientists to share their ideas, because it's much harder to critique someone for the accuracy of a poem, and people feel much more confident in that. Reason number two, it gives permission to the scientists to display pathos, to display emotion. You know, a lot of the times as scientists, we're told only communicate the cold, hard facts. And I think that's so damaging. It really damages the relationship between science and society. Researchers researching climate change and global warming, still affected by climate change and global warming, can still get angry about it, can still get upset about it, can still get frightened by it. So I think when we're conducting our research, doing the experiments, we need to be as objective as possible. But when we're talking about their impact, I think we need to display emotion, like necessarily so. And poetry affords us the opportunity to do that. And then thirdly, writing poetry together creates a safe space because there's a shared sense of vulnerability. You know, if I'm writing a poem and I see a professor write a poem and it's really bad, it's really bad rhymes and it's just not very good, then that's good, because I can see that that professor is actually fallible and is part of the same society as me. So writing poetry together is a really, really powerful way of leveling these hierarchies and enabling real dialogue to take place. So in this particular study, what we did was we worked with different audiences, and it was really important to identify specific audiences because each audience has their own experiences. And we asked them, you know, what do you want to know about environmental change? And then what we'd do is we'd write poems as a starting point, then we'd have a discussion with the scientists, then we'd write poems to reflect on it as well. And we weren't saying if people wanted to talk about things that were slightly off topic and weren't climate change, like pollution or like plastics, they were welcome to do so, because we didn't want to shut any avenue of conversation down. And in one of these sessions, which was in a inner city region in Manchester, just off the most polluted bus route in Europe, so incredible amounts of air pollution, we had this conversation, and then one of the participants, a non-scientist, wrote this poem. I've never seen pollution, never noticed it. It's always been here, but I'm unaware of it, just breathing it in. And for me, and for the scientists in the room, this was such a powerful, like 5 lines ones that really communicate some of the issues that we need to deal with in terms of environmental change, in terms of climate change, and in terms of the equality of the mitigation and adaptation strategies that we're recommending. You know, I'm really privileged to be an academic in a full-time position. You know, I'm a white heterosexual cis male in full-time employment and a middle class. I couldn't be more privileged. And if I knew there was an area of air pollution nearby, I'd probably want to move, and I might have the resources to be able to move. But what about those people who don't have the resources to move? And what about those people who don't even know that there's a problem? And these people, who are the people who are probably contributing the least to issues of pollution and climate change, their carbon footprint compared to the carbon footprint of many of the privileged people is much, much smaller. And yet these people's voices are not being heard. So how can we work with these people? How can we hear these voices? And how can we start dialogue that means we can then think about ways that we can not only ensure that people know that what's going on, but also develop strategies that can really help these people? You know, so how can we think about diverting traffic away from these areas, or thinking about ways so that people aren't left behind? So poetry is a really, really powerful way that enables us to engender those dialogues. Yes, it's a great way to communicate research in a one-way method. You know, I've written about it in my that I very kindly talked about. But for me, the real power of poetry is in facilitating this dialogue and creating a space through which this dialogue can take place. I want to mention briefly as well the journal that I helped to run, called Consilience, that Sundata very kindly mentioned. And previously, I just talked about the need for scientists to display pathos. And I think this is really important, right? The need to display emotion. And I know so many scientists who are also incredibly talented musicians, poets, sculptors, artists, dancers, everything, right? And so many times we're told that you're a scientist, or you're an artist, or you're a poet, stick it in your little box. Don't come out of your box, stay in that box. Whereas actually we're all just human beings with infinite potential if we're allowed to do that. So this is part of the reason that I helped to set up Consilience, and it's the world's first peer-reviewed science and poetry journal. We're always open to submissions. We have one edition a quarter, and basically we want people to write poems about science, about a particular theme. This issue's themes on failure. And we want to work with people, because a lot of times when you submit poetry as like if you're starting off, the poem's either like completely accepted or it's completely rejected, and you don't get any feedback on it. What we try to do here is we try to accept all of the poems that we get, but we work with our editors and our reviewers to help the poets to develop their poem in a really inclusive and accessible and diverse fashion. So I'm really proud we have like the editorial team. There's about 50 of us across 6 continents. We're just missing Antarctica. If you would like to get involved in helping us run the journal, please just drop me an email. Visit us on consiliencejournal.com. Come and join us on Facebook. We've got a really inclusive group. If people are interested in poetry and art and science, come and join us. Because as well as the poetry space, we also have an art space there called Consiliate, which is run by my colleagues, Louise and Katja. So please do come and check us out. And if you want to get involved, drop me an email. And the reason we set this up is a way to, really help to give a space for scientists and poets to come together and to develop dialogue and to think about how we can start to address some of the wicked problems, such as climate change and global warming. So that's poetry. So poetry, it's amazing. It's a great way of communicating science in both a one-way and a two-way method. But what about games? So I'm going to be talking about tabletop games. So they're games that you can play on a table, analog games, board games, cards games, role-playing games. I'm not going to be talking about digital games. I love digital games. I love video games. I play a lot of video games. Video games are amazing for communicating science, but I don't possess any of the skills that enable me to design a video game. So what I'm going to be talking about is tabletop games. But why tabletop games? Well, I've written here, the strength of tabletop games lies in the creation of a safe space in which to engage in discussions of complex and at times contentious topics, and in enabling people to take control of their own learning. So what do I mean by this? Well, again, it's about creating a shared sense of vulnerability where we can engage in dialogue. So when you play a game with someone, when you play a board game with someone, when you play a card game with someone, you sit down at the table and you engage in a series of contracts with the people that you're playing with in order to play the game. And these are rules that don't need to exist away from the gaming table, but they exist whilst you're playing games. And as you're playing the game, what you're doing is you're negotiating contracts that enable you to play the game and to work out how you can basically get the win conditions of the game. So to give you an example of this in practice, let's imagine that I'm playing Monopoly with some data. Now, if I'm playing Monopoly with some data, it's perfectly acceptable, indeed advisable, for me to try and bankrupt some data. That's what I want to do. I want to try and bankrupt her. However, that behavior away from the gaming table is unacceptable, right? I don't want to try and bankrupt anybody away from the gaming table. But when we sit down to play the game, we have negotiated those contracts. And because we've negotiated those contracts, it enables us to create a space in which behaviors that we might not normally have away from the gaming table can take place. So again, it enables us to level those hierarchies, because no matter what the hierarchical relationship between me and some data away from the tabletop is, when we sit down to play the game together, we've negotiated the same set of contracts, we've created an environment. In game studies, we call this the magic circle, in which these dialogues and these conversations can take place. And so because we've negotiated these contracts, we've created a space in which meaningful conversations, meaningful dialogue can take place. And also, games are just fun. I mean, look at this guy here. He's got a piece of plastic attached to his head, trying to pick something up from the center of the table. What's not fun about that? So to give you an example of this in practice and how we've used games as a way to try and start conversations again about climate change. A lot of the examples I give are with climate change, mainly because my background is as an environmental scientist and as an atmospheric physicist. And almost all of the games work that I do is with my good colleague and friend, Dr. Paul Wake from Manchester Metropolitan University. And in 2019, Paul and I, as part of a grant that was through Edinburgh University, what we wanted to do was we wanted to design an expansion to the popular game Catan. So Catan is a really popular tabletop game. Here's a picture of it on the left. For those of you who don't know the game, basically in it you play people who have arrived on an island called Catan, and the aim of the game is for you to be the person who most successfully colonizes that island. So who builds the most cities, who builds the most roads, who builds the most villages, by using up resources. Now, it's a great game, but there's many issues with the concept of that. Now, leaving aside the colonialism aspect, which has been dealt with very, very effectively by other colleagues of mine, I want to just think about the idea of limitless resources. So in the original version of Catan, there are limitless resources: brick, wool, ore, wood. And you can keep mining these resources over and over and over again in order to build your villages, your cities, and your roads. But we know that in real life, that doesn't happen, and that there is not only a limit to these resources, but that the more of these resources we use, the more fossil fuels are used up, the more emissions are released into the atmosphere, and the greater the effect of global warming and climate change. So Paul and I created an expansion for Catan called Global Warming, in which the resources become limited and in which you have a choice. You can start to use more of the resources, but in doing so, you can exacerbate the effects of global warming, and you can actually end up with a condition where nobody wins and the entire island state is destroyed as a result of a runaway greenhouse effect. For those of you who are interested, you can check out this research here in JCOM, the Journal of Science Communication, which also includes a link to the game in English and in German. We're very, very interested in people who would like to help us translate the game into other languages as well, so please get in contact if that's the case. And this game, we know, this expansion has been played by thousands of people. Anecdotally, I know that they've enjoyed it. But is it dialogue? Is this dialogue? And I don't know, because again, I know anecdotally from speaking to people that when they've played the game, they've started talking about climate change. They've started thinking about the decisions that they make and the impact that that has on a real world environment. But again, it's something that Paul and I chose a game, chose a topic, and we decided this is what we're going to communicate. And yes, we're hopefully inciting dialogue, but it's not really a two-way process. Again, the real power of games comes when you're able to create an environment in which dialogue and actually co-creation can take place. So this is a game that Paul and I developed for the climate charity Possible. So Carbon City Zero is a game that we started work on in 2019. And you can see here some images of the game's development. And basically, what we wanted to do was we wanted to create a game that got people thinking about decarbonisation and got people thinking about how difficult it was to create a net zero city. So as a city that had zero carbon emissions. So in the UK and across the world, many cities and countries have targets for becoming net zero. So the UK is going to be net zero by 2050. Edinburgh is going to be net zero by 2032. Newcastle by 2025. But what does this actually mean? And like, how difficult is this to achieve? So we knew that we wanted to try and start conversations about this because Possible had told us that it was a really important conversation, this idea of decarbonisation. But we didn't really know where to start. So what we did was we ran many sessions where we brought together, you can see here, this image here, with people, the third from the left, where we brought together lots of different publics. So policymakers, activists, students, teachers, industry experts, researchers, community leaders. And we asked them, what do you think decarbonisation is? And what do you think the biggest opportunities and the biggest challenges are to developing cities that are zero carbon in terms of technology, in terms of people's skills, in terms of opportunities? And we listened to all of these ideas. And then what we did was we got all of those and we created a basic game mechanic around cards in which you play as a city mayor. And you start with basically a pretty bad city in terms of you've not really got much money, you've got poor housing stock, you've got pretty dirty roads, etc. And then the idea is that you invest and you start to improve your deck of cards, which represents your city, so that you can reduce the carbon of your city down to zero. And we play tested this with hundreds of people, as you can see in these images here. Again, different audiences, with researchers, with policymakers, with activists, with school children, etc. So that we knew that the mechanics worked, the science was accurate, and that it was starting to have conversations. And this worked really, really well. We launched the game on Kickstarter. We made quite a lot of money up for it, which we then used to buy extra copies of the game, which we then sent out to people, which is great. And yeah, it was going really, really well. We had this co-created game. And then people started asking Paul and me questions, and they said, Sam, Paul, I like the game, but why is it competitive? Why do each of you take on a city as a mayor, and why are you all competing to be the world's first zero carbon city? Wouldn't it make more sense for it to be a collaborative game where you're working together to try and reduce the carbon output of your city? And Paul and I did not have a response to that question because it was an excellent question. So what we did was we made another game, or rather we made a second edition of the game called Carbon City Zero World Edition, which you can see here, in which you collaborate together to reduce the carbon of your city down to zero. And this was great because this had really established a dialogue in which we'd listened to our playtesters, we'd listened to our audiences who told us something. And by listening to them, rather than just it being a box ticking exercise, they actually made the game much better. So this is the second edition, Carbon City Zero World Edition. And it plays as a collaborative game. You can also pair it with a competitive mode, but the collaborative game is really fun. And it was a great lesson for us about how you can really have meaningful dialogue and co-creation in game development for science communication. I just want to show this picture here as well, because this really shows the design development of the game. So on the far left, we have a picture of the cards that Paul and I used when we were prototyping the game, just trying to make it work before we put it in front of anyone. And we'd started off by calling it like a large tax. And then we made this card and it looked okay. And then we started playing with a few people. And then people said, tax doesn't really make sense. It should probably be a factory instead. So then we made this card here. And this card in the middle is the absolute limit of our design skills. So at this point, we realized we need to work with people who are much better designers and much better graphic and much better artists than us. So we worked with the artist Tony Pickering and the graphic designer Matt Bonner, and they made this beautiful card here. And this was a great lesson again for us, right? Games are great because they enable you to collaborate. Scientists, what they do really well is collaborate. They realize that they don't have all of the skills or all of the equipment or all of the intelligence to do one task or many tasks by themselves. So they work with lots of different people. And the same here. If you're a games designer, you're not necessarily going to have all of the skills to design a game, like including the artwork and graphic design. So it helps to work with other people. And at this point, we then showed the card to some people who are experts in accessibility. And what they commented on, so Michael Heron, who's a great person in terms of game accessibility for both analog and digital games, they came with some really good comments about how we could make the game more accessible to different audiences, so that it would be helpful for people who had visual impairments and people who had cognitive difficulties as well. And then that resulted in this card here. So this is an improvement that will then hopefully aid the design process even more as well. So really listening to the accessibility expert, and again, working with those audiences who had accessibility issues was great, because it not only did it make the game more accessible for them, it ultimately made the game more accessible for everybody else. So this is what's known as the curb cut effect, that when you make a game better so that everybody can use it, it doesn't just make it better for those people who have accessibility issues, it makes it better for everybody. So for example, if you make it so that it's easier for people with visual impairments to play the game, it also means that you can play the game better in an environment with poor lighting, such as a pub or a science festival. So that's why accessibility is really important, and it shouldn't just be a box ticking exercise done at the end. It should be something that's built into the design process at the very beginning. Play these games, go and play them. They are available for free to download as a print and play. So you can just print it at home, print it out on your printer, both Catan, Global Warming, Carbon City Zero and Carbon City Zero World Edition, available on P&P Arcade. P&P just stands for print and play. So just Google P&P Arcade and look for Carbon City Zero. You can download it for free. And Carbon City Zero and soon Carbon City Zero World Edition are available on Tabletopia, which is an online space in which you can play board games for free. There's premium versions as well, but you can play our game for free, which, especially in a time of COVID where it's difficult to actually sit down around a table, is a really great opportunity and a great boon. So really, games, like I said, offer this amazing opportunity, yes, to communicate by creating a space in which we can have a conversation, but they're even better when we co-create the games with those audiences that we want to engender a dialogue with, because then we can listen to those voices and build it into the game, thus making the game better. So this is why the whole point about science communication, why we need to involve audiences, diverse audiences. It's not because it's a box ticking exercise. It's because these people have different ways of looking at the world, have different knowledge bases, have different expertise, have different lived experiences. And if we want to try and solve like truly wicked interdisciplinary problems, we need as many different viewpoints on those ideas as possible, which is why we need to give voice to them and create a platform in which all of those voices can be heard and acted upon. So return to this hypothesis I had at the beginning. Hopefully, I've convinced you that poetry and games can be used to engender dialogue and to give voice to those audiences that are normally underheard and underserved by science and science communication. Do you want to collaborate? Look, I love working with poetry, I love working with games, but I love working with people even more. So if you want to come and join us on Consilience, if you want to design a game with me, if you want to write poetry with me, if you want to just chat about science communication, please get in contact with me. Like via Twitter is normally the best place, but you can check me out on my website as well. And I'd love to design games and write poetry with you, and find out more about what you do as well. So there are my details there. Really happy to take any questions you might have. And thank you very much again to Sundata and the team for inviting me to come and speak to you today. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. So there are already 2 questions, so we'll start with them. Saujanya, can you please unmute IPSA? And after IPSA, we'll go to Beena. Okay, Saujanya.
Hi, Sundata.
Yes.
I guess Itza has left because we can't see an attendees list.
Okay, let me read out IPSA's question.
Yes.
How do you scale up interactions like writing poetry together or making zines together?
This is a really good question. I think scale up is, like, speaking honestly, one of the things I struggled with originally. And I think that making zines and writing poetry work really, really well in workshop environments, but how can you scale that up across a city or across a country? And what I would say is that you do that by working with other people. So I've tried to do things by myself in the past and it just doesn't work. So that's why really I started Consilience, because this is a way to get like-minded people together. And if you think you can do a lot by yourself, when you've got 50 people working on the topic, you can do 50 times as much, right? So I would say the best way, scale up is so important. It's a brilliant question. But the best way to do it is just to find other like-minded people. Like, what other poetry groups do you know? Who else is making zines? And how can you pool your resources to create an opportunity, maybe look at applying for grants together, but just coming together and pooling that. And then also like signal sharing, right? So it's like, okay, I run a zine, you run a zine, my friend runs a zine. Let's advertise each other's zines. Let's create spaces together. Let's share resources. So yeah, collaborating, in my opinion, not the only way, really the most effective way of doing that, definitely. But that's a fantastic question.
So do you mean that if there are enough number of local events happening around zine or poetry making, that is the way to scale up?
Yeah, I mean, not even locally. I mean, if IPSA's got a friend who's, living on the other side of the world, if they're doing a zine, but you could find a way maybe to like host a joint Zoom meeting or to share each other's zines. You could get your group to create zines, post them to the other group and then cross collaborate. But basically scaling up, the best way to scale up those individual interactions is to work with other people that are doing similar things to you, to share that, to be generous and just to be like critical friends and just share ideas. And I think that's definitely the best way to do it.
Okay, Beena asks, how long does it typically take to take a game from an idea to something that is ready to play?
That's such a good question. Okay, there's 2 answers to this, right? So like taking a game to something that I can play with myself or that me and Paul can play, you can do that in like an afternoon, right? Like that's quite a fun thing. But then you quickly realize as you're prototyping it. So I use the word prototype to distinguish from or to differentiate from playtest. Prototypes when you're kind of just doing it with yourself or like with your colleague. But taking it then to go and play with people, we would then play test it with like an inner circle of people, right? So like friends and colleagues who I wouldn't be too upset about when they told me it was rubbish, and they'd be able to tell me it was rubbish. But creating like Carbon City Zero, for example, from going from the initial concept to getting it like printed on Kickstarter, it took like 1.5 years. It's like a long process to get it right and to get it going, just as like any research project would be, right? Like thinking about a traditional like lab idea, you can think of the idea to go and experiment in the lab, but you're not going to be able to do all of those measurements, analyze the data, reflect on it, revisit your hypothesis in an afternoon. It's going to take you months to do it. So yes, to some extent, how long is a piece of string, but it really does take a long period of time. However, those initial concepts take happen much, much quicker.
So Beena also wants to ask a follow-up question on what are the common pitfalls for a new person who's getting into game development?
Okay, common pitfalls. So first of all, I would recommend you checking out that JCOM Science Communication article because it's got a lot of tips in it. Paul and I have hopefully got another article coming out as well with some more advice. I'd say one of the best piece of advice I can give about any of this, right, is just to do it. Like I have massive imposter syndrome, as I'm sure many of us do. I'm always asking myself, oh God, am I a scientist? Am I a poet? Am I a games designer? Am I any of these things? But like, the only thing stopping you doing things is sometimes your own brain going, I can't do that. So I think the biggest hurdle sometimes to get over is giving yourself permission that you're allowed to do it. And as soon as you've written a poem, one poem on a post note in the back of a journal, you are a poet. As soon as you've created a game mechanic that works, that you can play with yourself, you're a games designer. You don't have to have awards, you don't have to publish books. That's what you are. So I would say the biggest thing is just like your own like mental imposter syndrome telling you can't do it. I'm telling you can. Everybody that's listening to this is infinitely more intelligent than I am. And yet, if I've been able to do this, you can definitely do it as well.
So continuing on games, Siddharth wants to know, how do you popularize the games that you develop? Okay,
Siddharth, that's a great question. So I think with everything, it's about working with the audiences first. So building those relationships up. So if you're designing a game around climate change for school children, like high school children between the ages of, let's say, 14 and 16, first of all, how can you work with those audiences? And then how can you ensure that those audiences can then pass it on to their colleagues, their friends, etc. So it's really important, as with all science communication, to think carefully about your audience. We all know there's no such thing as a general public. There's many different publics. People have many different hats of which they identify. So what is the specific audience you're working with? And then once you've developed the game with them, again, if you're developing something with them, it makes the game better, but it also grants agency to those people because they feel as though they're part of the process, and then they want to share it with their friends. They want to use the game, they want to popularize it. So really work very carefully with your audience in the first instance.
Manasvi, could you go next with your question? Yes, Manasvi, you can speak now.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was already speaking. Okay. Hi. This is a very interesting talk. I actually recently started planning on teaching visually impaired students. And when you mentioned games, I was like, this is a great way to, get them interested in science and all of that. And then I realized, oops, they're visually impaired. So how do you make this more accessible? Can I still print the games and make them play? Is that possible? Like, I'm confused. Is there a way out? Is there something I can do? Yeah.
No, that's a really good question, Manasvi. So I would say that our game, we've tried to make it as accessible as possible, but for people who are heavily visually impaired, I'd still say there was many issues with being able to play it. There are, however, I would really recommend you checking out a website called Meeple Like Us, MEEPLE, Like Us, which is run by Michael Heron. And Michael makes lots of recommendations for games that are brilliant for people with visual impairments. And the best way to design games is really to try and remove any reliance on the visual element. So, for example, instead of having tokens with numbers on them that represent different in-game currencies, can you instead make the tokens have different shapes and different sizes, like currency in real life, so that people with visual impairments can feel it instead of having to look on it? And that's also then useful for everybody else as well. So we play test our game with people that had some visual impairments, but it's definitely not perfect. And for people that are severely visually limited or with severe visual impairments, especially, for example, people who might be legally blind, I don't think it's necessarily the best game, but there are other games out there that do a much better job of that. And speaking for myself personally and for Paul, I know it's something we're trying much harder to do in all of our future games as well.
Thank you. Can you repeat the website again?
Yeah, of course. It's. I'll put it in the chat as well. But it's Meeple Like Us. I'll put that in the chat. But it's Meeple Like Us, basically.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Dave, you can go next.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Sam. This was a really interesting discussion. And so I was just wondering that can we use the game mechanics of already established games to design a game of our own interest? Are there copyright issues involved with that?
Yeah, Devesh, it's a great question. So what I'd say is 2 pieces of advice here, right? First of all, check with the games designer first. So a lot of, Catan's a really cool one because it's actually operated under a fair use policy where they're trying to encourage people to use it as they want, as long as you're not trying to make money off it. So go onto the website, see what use they've got, but then just get in contact with the games developer and just say, look, I'm thinking of making a modification for your game. Be okay. I don't want to make any money off it. I just want to, use it as a way to talk about trees being felled or air pollution or something like that. So check, always check. Either go on the website or just get in contact with the games designer. And the second piece of advice is anything that you make, I personally would always recommend making it available as Creative Commons. So even if you were going to try and sell the game, have it as a print and play that's Creative Commons like 4.0 BY, so anybody can use it, but they have to acknowledge you if they're using it again. And the reason for that is that people will then use your game, they'll modify that game, and they'll use that to start new conversations as well. So to answer your question, always check first, but when you're making your own games, I would always try to release them under a very generous Creative Commons license so that other people can modify it in that way as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Owen, could you go next?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Sam. I really love your philosophy, your scientific philosophy. I actually read your article in Nature last year just by chance. A magazine was sitting on the side, and it inspired me to buy a book to write some poetry in. So was there a specific trigger or moment that you realized that poetry and science was a passion for you? Anything similar?
Thanks, Owen. That's really kind of you. And hopefully, please do submit some of that work to Consilience, Owen. I guess for me, when I was younger, I was in a band, right? And I thought I was going to be this really cool, successful lead singer and poet. So I've always been really interested in poetry and writing. And when I did my A levels at school, it was very physics, maths, advanced maths, chemistry. I did a physics undergraduate degree, but then I was always really interested in the arts. And I was just convinced that there must be a way to try and combine the two. And I literally just sat down and was like, look, I love writing poetry, and poetry is one way of trying to describe the world that we live in. And science seems to be another way of trying to describe the world that we live in. So maybe they're just different ways of looking at things. So I don't think there was a proper trigger moment, but it was kind of just a realization that, look, these two things shouldn't be mutually exclusive entities, but rather complementary friends that try to work together to offer different parts of the same jigsaw. And I'd encourage anyone who has any other passion in life, away from science, which is enough of a passion, to try and think of how you can use that passion to try and communicate science as well. So is that baking? Is that yoga? Is that dancing? Is that games? Is that poetry? What is that comedy? And I think that by doing that, we grant ourselves pathos, don't we, to try and break down those barriers between science and society, and instead just to have this amorphous society to which we all belong.
Yep, I agree completely. I love that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Annapurna, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. Sam, that was a really good talk. So my question is, what do you think about using parodies of popular shows, maybe songs used in popular shows and movies, and maybe building your poetry around that? And these could be parts of games as well. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Annapurna. That's a really good question. So I think that, you know, using things that people are already identified with, be it famous songs, be it famous clips, be it like memes, be it like, I guess, social concepts that we've got ideas with, are a great hook because people know about them already. And we can think of loads of examples of people who've used comedy well, who've used songs well, who've used poetry well, like much better than me. And the reason that works is it taps into those social contracts and that popular culture that people have already got. So I think it can be really, really effective. What I would say is, like, so sometimes we need to be a bit careful, like especially around, like, not with the medium, but how we use it. So if we're thinking about like memes or comedy, like we could think, for example, I strongly believe that vaccinations, not just for COVID, but for everything, are really important, right? And that everybody should be vaccinated as much as possible. And I disagree with anti-vaxxers and what their attitudes are. However, if I was to like do a comedy sketch or a comedy song or a meme that poked fun at those people for their beliefs, that's really damaging, because what it does is it further entrenches their beliefs, because they think, oh God, here's the like left liberal elite that are telling me what to think. Look at them laughing at me. And we're just distancing ourselves from them. And this is a huge problem, like globally. I mean, it's a political issue as well, that we deny people the opportunity to have a conversation and to try and understand where they're coming from. So if we're thinking about anti-vaxxers as an example, why do they have those attitudes in the first instance? So when we're establishing dialogue, it shouldn't be about to try and change people's minds or laugh at them or think that we're better than people. It should be about trying to understand what has happened in their life to enable them to get to that point. And when we have these dialogues, we need to be able to realize that we're doing so in a way that is compassionate, and that we're not better than anybody else just because we understand more science. I know this wasn't what you were saying at all, by the way, but it's just, I think when we're using things that like our memes, that are comedy sketches, I think we just need to be generous with them. I mean, that's my opinion on, I love comedy, but I find comedy that pokes fun at people to be very easy. Whereas I find comedy that's, nice and pleasant and brings commonalities together much harder, but actually much funnier and a much more enriching and wholesome way to go about doing things.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question now. So,
of course,
what are your metrics to judge the success in the sense of efficiency of what you are looking at, your objective of achieving your objectives through poetry or games? How do you measure their effectiveness?
I can't believe you're asking me a question about metrics. Okay, right. So look, we're scientists, right? We get judged by metrics, we get judged by KPIs. Like, right? No, exactly. And look, I come from a really positivist mindset, like with physics, with atmospheric science, that's very much, here's a control set, here's an experimental set, what percentage of people have we changed? But I've come to realize through science communication, through pedagogy, that actually that's not how I want to live, and that's not, in my opinion, how we can measure metrics. Look, yes, things should be impactful. We should do things because they're impactful, but how can we measure that impact? And for me, like a perfect example would be Owen just telling me there that as a result of reading an article that I wrote, he went away and wrote poetry. That's made my day to know that, right? Because that means that something I've done's been impactful. If you can make a positive difference, I know this sounds so trite, but if you can make a positive difference in one person's life by doing what you're doing, I think that's huge impact. And I think that it's difficult because we get judged in academia and in science against certain metrics and against certain KPIs. And yeah, look, I know X number of thousand people have played the games I've read, or read the poetry that I've written, or read my blog, or listened to my podcast. But how many of those have actually engaged with what I've done in a meaningful way? And I think that it's only by having actual conversations and using qualitative data as well as that quantitative stuff that we have. So I would say, Sundar, to answer your question, what I try to do is just keep a record of positive impacts that I've had, or that the work that I've had has had, and try to always remember those when I'm in it. So when I'm next writing a poem and I'm like, well, this isn't very good, or I get my 20,000th rejection for my poetry collection, I'll think to myself, do you know what? Actually, Owen read my Nature article and started writing poetry, so what I'm doing is all right. But that's a great question, though, Sundara. Thank you.
And probably also, like, if somebody's objective is only to inform, it's much easier to measure that kind of impact. On the other hand, if you're trying to inspire, then it's way more difficult. You don't know where to draw the lines and where do you say that this is positive impact.
I think that's definitely true. I think that's really true. And I think as well, though, that, just because you raised it, I think a lot of the times, right, in science communication, people are like, oh, one-way communication is bad. Everything should be two-way. And I don't actually think that's the case, right? I think in order for us to have meaningful dialogue, people need to be possessed of a certain amount of facts. Like that is, I think that's true. So I think that some forms of science communication need to impart knowledge or need to provide people with basic information that is scientific fact, so that they can at least start to discuss it or start to question that as well. And I would say that's like a dissemination model, not a deficit model, a dissemination model. And I think that is necessary. And I agree that we can think about ways of measuring if people have remembered scientific facts or not. And that's actually still really important in terms of how much dialogue has started from that as well.
So somebody wants to know, how do you fund the game development? How do you
Do I fund it? I don't. Okay, that's a really good question. So look, again, I'm speaking from a position of privilege, right? I'm a full-time tenured academic who can apply for research grants, can use some of that research grants, can use some of my time as an academic to do these things, which means that I'm in a position to do that. If you're really interested in creating games, something like Kickstarter is such a great model, because it means that if you can develop the game by yourself, you can go and prototype it, you can play test it, and then when you want to create it, you can use other people's like money and people's belief in you up front to pay for it and to purchase it. So things like Kickstarter, things like Indiegogo are really, really great. The other model, of course, is to develop a game and then take it to a games publisher or a games designer and say to them, look, I've got this game. Do you want to license it from me or pay me for developing it further? So to answer the question specifically, I tend to use research grants to be able to pay for like the pump priming, to be able to start getting it going. And then we found that Kickstarter is a really effective way to be able to get people to like purchase the game and then use that as an upfront cost to like pay for a little bit of the development, like the artist's work, the designer's work, etc. So yeah, good question there.
I have a question which is related to the Carbon City Zero. So I'm assuming that in a game like this, you would have given certain weightage to certain actions. Like if you do a certain thing, this is going to be so much carbon expensive, and if you do a certain other thing, then it's going to be cheaper in carbon expense. And if that is how the game runs, then how do you decide those weights that you should give for any action?
That is a good question. So I think what we did with this particular game, so in this game, basically you're buying different things. Like let's say, for example, let's look at the image that's on the screen. We can see that we've got bike lanes and car share, right? So when we were designing these, we tried to get it so that the power of the cards, like how much carbon they reduce, how much they cost, the special rules that they have, are reflective of how powerful they are in the real world at implementing change. But, and this isn't like us being lazy, like we wanted it to promote dialogue and we wanted it to be provocative. So if people play this game and they're like, hold on a second, these bike lanes are far too powerful, that's great, because what that means is that you're then having a conversation on the table, because someone's like, what do you mean they're too powerful? I thought bike lanes were great. And then somebody else might say, but what you really want is peat restoration. So actually by provoking those dialogues, that's exactly what we want to have. if everything was exactly the same, you wouldn't be able to have that. So we work with experts, we work with different publics to try to get it as balanced as possible, but we know, and purposely so, that they're not all perfect, because we wanted to provoke dialogue in that way.
That's really nice to know.
So Parina's asked on the chat, where do we publish poems about science? Consilience, just come to Consilience, which I put the link to earlier, but just Google Consilience Journal. You can come and publish with us. So you need to basically look at the upcoming submission window, but then you're really, really welcome to join us. I would say that we are the best platform to come and publish poems about science, definitely.
All right, so I think we have addressed everyone's questions, and we're also one hour up. So thank you very much, Sam, for your time today. And the discussion was amazingly good. And I already see how many people are already thinking of how to develop poems, or where to publish them, or how to make games. And I'm hoping that there will be a lot of people who will want to connect with you on these. And in general, the science communication community in India just grows bigger and more diverse. And
fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sundata. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Bye now.